He commanded millions, built monumental palaces, and marched armies across continents. And yet, on a single night of wine and display, King Xerxes set into motion a punishment for his daughter that many contemporaries later described as worse than death. Herodotus records the scene, and later administrative fragments and palace receipts give the story a cold, bureaucratic shape, a public promise, a private conviction, and a life that from that night onward was quietly, relentlessly erased. The banquet in question was the kind of performance that empires stage to prove they are unassailable. It took place in the summer of 479 BC, in a Persepolis awash with torches, perfumed oils, and silk banners catching the heat like bright wings. For 7 days the court feasted and toasted, courtiers recited loyalties, and generals advertised their loyalty. The king, surrounded by the vast accoutrements of his rule, raised his cup and offered to grant a single request from any guest. That gesture, intended to magnify his magnanimity, had the opposite effect. It exposed a truth about absolute power. An emperor's word, once given in public, can be turned into a sentence, not just for a polity, but for a person. Xerxes was no petty despot. He was the inheritor of an empire that drew tribute from coast to plateau, whose administrators kept ledgers in several languages, and whose ceremonial elaboration was meant to reflect a cosmic order. Yet the Achaemenid court was also an arena where face mattered. Kings, according to both Persian custom and the Greek observers who wrote about them, obliged themselves to appear consistent and sovereign before their subjects. To rescind a promise made under the influence of wine would be to reveal a weakness, something a king could ill afford. That tension between paternal instinct and imperial image is the hinge upon what followed turned. Herodotus, our most detailed Greek narrative for this period, relates that it was Artabazus, a high-ranking general and man of considerable standing within the palace, who stepped forward to exploit the offer. Artabanus was decades older than the king's daughter. He was a veteran of campaigns, a figure whose authority in the army and the capital made a petition from him difficult to refuse. He asked, in front of the entire court, for the hand of Amestris, Xerxes' daughter. Amestris was likely 14 by Greek reckoning, still an adolescent by any ancient standard, raised in the inner precincts of the royal household, schooled in courtly arts, and surrounded by attendants and eunuchs whose job it was to keep the royal women both safe and invisible. Her youth and status made her an emblem of dynastic continuity, an asset in alliances that ranged from tribal chiefs to leading courtiers. The scene that followed is captured in the blunt terms of both embarrassment and policy.
To deny Artabanus publicly would have been to contradict an imperial proclamation. To grant him would be to trade a daughter for political stability. Xerxes, convinced perhaps that the king's voice must be law even when it had been loosened by drink, acceded. He granted the request in front of witnesses. Sources record his reluctance. Later accounts recall that he attempted to soften the blow, that he tried to frame the concession as a matter of statecraft rather than paternal acquiescence, but the oath stood. What began as a theatrical moment of royal generosity became, in effect, a transfer of a child into the hands of a powerful man whose ambitions were not merely marital. It is tempting to treat this as a courtly oddity or a page of palace gossip, but the documentary trail suggests a harsher reality. Palace tablets and financial records from the period show payments for midwives, physicians, and what the scribes refer to as treatments, connected to a royal household woman who is plausibly identified with Amestris. These entries do not narrate cruelty. They document administrative responses to reproductive matters in the language of receipts and rations. Still, when combined with Herodotus's narrative, they build a picture of a life that had been repurposed, from daughter to dynastic instrument, to an object subjected to surveillance and intervention. It is here that we must pause and ask what it means to live under a sovereign's decree. If worse than death seems an extreme judgment, consider the shape of the sentence imposed. Marriage in the royal family was not a private affection. It was a political contract carried out under constant observation. Amestris was moved into Artabanus's household, where she lived surrounded by attendants but separated from the warmth of her natal family. Sources suggest that the relationship was not one of partnership, but of property and obligation. Where a husband in our modern sense might offer companionship, the arrangement appears to have been primarily reproductive, a pattern of isolation, frequent examinations by midwives and physicians, and a relentless pressure to conceive heirs. Some of these details come from Herodotus's account. Others come from administrative fragments that record payments for fertility-related services. Together, they imply a regime of reproductive coercion. Years into the marriage, Amestris became pregnant. The court rejoiced, as any announcement of offspring in a royal line signaled continuity and stability. The pregnancy, however, ended in tragedy. Her child was born frail, lived only 10 days, and then died. Herodotus records the infant's death. He also records that the death did not settle the matter. Rumors circulated, rumors that must be treated with caution, because ancient rumor can conflate fact and courtly slander. Some accounts suggested neglect, others whispered of intentional harm.
Palace whispers, as Herodotus and other sources imply, always had political valences. A dead infant could be read as bad omen, as evidence of witchcraft, or as proof of someone's malicious intent. The documentary record offers no conclusive forensic verdict. It records an infant's brief existence, and then administrative actions, payments for burial rites, possibly for physicians' explanations, and later an intensified atmosphere of suspicion and surveillance. What followed was an escalation in private violence. It is here that the moral core of the story becomes most painful. Herodotus and the narratives that cling to his report portray Artabanus as a man whose temper hardened after the child's death. He grew more suspicious and more controlling toward Amestris. Where earlier there had been monitoring and reproductive pressure, now violence and isolation increased. The sources stop short of detailed descriptions of physical abuse. They record instead the consequences: Amestris's withdrawal from courtly life, reports of her being kept away from the company of other women, and administrative entries that suggest her needs were met, but her autonomy was not. The documentary's silence about the precise nature of the abuse is itself telling. In palace societies, much suffering left only bureaucratic traces, payments, rations, and lists, rather than the narrative of personal testimony that might otherwise inflame outrage. The private cruelties soon intersected with public ambition. Political tensions between powerful courtiers and members of the royal family were seldom purely personal. They carried the risk of regime instability. Artabanus, emboldened and resenting both the corpse of his child and the status he felt he commanded, became the focal point of factional plotting. Sources suggest that ambition, humiliation, and calculated strategy converged. In time, Artabanus conspired to remove Xerxes from the throne. Herodotus records that Xerxes was assassinated and that Artabanus briefly seized power. The act of killing the emperor, whatever his public grandeur, was also an act of private revenge by a man who had been given, in presence of the court, a daughter he perhaps never truly sought to protect. Artabanus's triumph, however, was short-lived. The political machinery of the Achaemenid state and the dynastic loyalties of the royal family coalesced against him. Artaxerxes, Xerxes' son, marshaled support and suppressed the rebellion. Artabanus was executed. The high drama of palace coups is well known: conspiracies, betrayals, and swift reversals. But the political outcome is not the only aftermath that matters. For Amestris, whatever brief legal liberation followed her husband's execution did not translate into recovery. Contemporary accounts and later fragments suggest that she survived, she lived on, but her life had been hollowed. The concept of a life destroyed conjures images of bodily annihilation or public execution. This is not the case here. Amestris did not die immediately. She lingered for years, and the records place her death in 457 BC. Yet the phrase, worse than death, seeks to capture what happened to her interior world. Her agency, her prospects for marriage on her own terms, her capacity to mother, and the ordinary joys of relationship and self-direction were stripped away. She was transformed from a person with a family, friends, and a future into someone whose days were counted in administrative notations and whose grief had no public redress. That slow dissolution, what might rightly be called psychological annihilation, can destroy an ordinary person more completely than a single violent end. To be forced into a life that is not your own, to have your body instrumentalized, to watch your child die under circumstances that breed suspicion, and to face daily humiliation without recourse, these are harms that scar beyond tissue. We must be careful not to impose modern categories on antiquity. The idea that a father's public word could convert his daughter into a political instrument was part of the politics of many ancient courts. Persian customs placed royal authority and the maintenance of state image above individual preference. Yet contextualizing practice is not excusing it. Sources give us both the social logic and the moral consequences, and those consequences, an eroded self, permanent isolation, and the public invisibility of private suffering, are the human costs historians are obliged to notice. Herodotus, for all of his Greek prejudices, does not simply gloat over the court's decadence. He explains motives, records rumors, and leaves the human cost visible between his sentences. The palace archives and fragmentary Persian texts lend further weight to the broader pattern. They do not narrate dramas. They record the more mundane remnants of state intervention, lists of attendance, payments for medical supplies, and allocations for food and clothing. Scholars who study these tablets have argued that such records, when read alongside narrative texts, reveal a systematic treatment of royal women as wards of dynastic necessity. The ledger replaces testimony. Where no diary or intimate memoir survives, accounting practices become our evidence for how people's lives were regimented. In Amestris's case, the ledgers suggest a regulated reproductive life and medical attention mediated by court officials, not the agency of an autonomous woman, but the stewardship of state functionaries. Rumors of infanticide circulated in the palace and beyond, and we should treat them as what they are: contagious whispers that might contain grains of truth, slander used as political ammunition, or misreadings of medical tragedy. It is possible that the infant's frailty was a consequence of the stresses of pregnancy under coercion. It is equally possible that other medical complications were at play. No conclusive forensic proof survives.
Yet the political and personal fallout, Artabanus's increasing aggressiveness, the assassination of Xerxes, and Amestris's subsequent desolation, are documented in more than one source. When power is exercised within the family, victims are often doubly victimized, first by the perpetrator, then by a society inclined to explain away the suffering as misfortune or fate. There is a broader point here about the anatomy of absolute power. Empires are built on the capacity to make life and death into tools of policy, but their most corrosive effect is often private. A king who can command an army can also command anniversaries, marriages, and intimate choices. Such commands, when unrestrained, do lasting damage to the fabric of familial life. Oxford scholars and specialists in Achaemenid administration have repeatedly noted that the state's reach into domestic arenas, especially those involving royal reproduction, inflicted a routinized form of violence. Amestris's case, with its mixture of public spectacle and private devastation, exposes how a political culture that privileges majesty over mercy can produce tragedies that are invisible to victory lists and architectural inscriptions. We should also register the gendered dimension. Royal daughters were rarely the primary actors in political narratives, but their bodies often became the battlegrounds of dynastic politics. To be a daughter of the king was to be both elevated and constrained. The authority to give a daughter away or to allow her life to be shaped by political bargaining lay squarely with those who held the throne. That concentration of decision-making power meant that choices that would be intolerable in ordinary family life acquired an air of inevitability within the palace. Amestris's experience is therefore not an isolated cruelty, but a symptom of a system in which personal bonds are subordinated to statecraft, and where a parent's love can be converted into an institutional duty. How should a modern reader interpret this? We cannot translate ancient suffering into modern jurisprudence, nor should we romanticize the past. Yet we can illuminate the human stakes. Herodotus and the palace fragments do something historians are meant to do. They provide a mosaic of evidence that, when assembled, points to a pattern. Amestris's life, as partially reconstructed from these shards, shows how a single improvident or performative royal decision can cascade into a lifetime of diminished possibilities. That slow mortification of self, being reduced to an object, having one's reproductive capacity instrumentalized, enduring years of suspicion and isolation, can feel to contemporaries and to some later observers like a death that outlasts corporeal demise. The final chapters of this story are less about grand politics and more about quiet loss.
after Artabanus's execution, Amestris' formal status would have been restored, at least theoretically.
Yet the sources are clear that restoration did not equal recovery. Contemporary witnesses remembered her as withdrawn, as someone whose features had become older than her years. The official death recorded for her in 457 BC marks an end, but if we are honest with the fragments, the more meaningful end began decades earlier, the night of the banquet when a king's offhand promise was turned into a legal and familial chain. Her death, in that sense, was the final punctuation of a longer, state-orchestrated annihilation of choice and dignity. There is a moral coda to this that travels beyond Persia and beyond antique time. Empires and rulers often define themselves by public acts of magnificence, while the private violences that sustain such grandeur are minimized, buried in ledgers or told as rumor. Amestris is a reminder that the ledger sometimes tells a more brutal story than an epitaph. The humiliation and dispossession she endured were not merely private tragedies. They were the byproduct of a political culture that could prioritize reputation over compassion, ritual over relationality. To study her is to confront the private cost of public power. Historians cannot fully reconstruct Amestris' inner life, and we must respect the limits of our sources. We must also resist the temptation to reduce her to a symbol. She was a person who liked the ordinary intimacies of a royal upbringing, instruction in the arts, the companionship of attendants, a father's earlier indulgence. Those small details matter because they allow us to see what was taken from her. The archival fragments and Herodotus's narrative together ask us to remember the human faces behind political calculations. If this account has moved or unsettled you, leave a comment telling us which empire's hidden story we should examine next, and subscribe to the channel for more deep historical investigations into the dark side of power. Remember Amestris not only as a footnote in palace intrigues, but as a life that invites us to question how authority is wielded within families and states. The banquet that sealed her fate was a spectacle designed to glorify a man's rule. The real story that follows is the quiet erosion of a daughter's life. In that erosion lies a lesson about how absolute power, when turned inward, can destroy more thoroughly than a single violent end.